Welcome to our first webinar for fall 2020 for the Center for International Business, which is at Quinlan School of Business, Loyola University, Chicago. Our topic today is COVID-19's impact on international design and manufacturing industry. Our guest speaker is one of our alumni, Mr. Brian Maite, MBA, AUA, and MIES. He's an architect and director of commercial sales for ConTech Lighting, a Leviton company. His previous positions include director of pricing and strategy at PG Enlighten and director of architecture in Airroom Architecture. I am Cinar. I'm a professor of economics and I'm the director for the Center for International Business. I'm now going to turn over the meeting to Mr. Maite.
Thank you. Professor Cinar, thank you so much. The MIES is a member of the Illuminating Engineering Society. The AUA, a real quick modification, that's American Institute of Architects. That's actually the AIA. So I've had the great privilege of having Professor Cinar as an instructor and professor for my recent MBA, executive MBA at Loyola. So Quinlan is very near and dear to my heart. So I welcome all of you and hope that you are all doing well in this time of COVID. Was excited to have this opportunity to share some experiences with you and a little bit of a diverse background. And my life in business has really existed primarily around the design, construction, and manufacturing industries. There has always been a tie to international business and environment with all of those entities. As an architect, end users, clients, et cetera, have very much informed what, where, and how we design and build for that environment. It has a direct impact on the business environment, the exponential growth that's taken place in China and before that in the United Arab Emirates, in the Middle East, and even in the United States, in certain pockets where there has been great growth, there's been supply-demand issues time and time again. I have, in the current position I am in with the director of commercial sales for ConTech Lighting, I've had a direct impact on product development, forecasting, obviously sales figures, as well as informing the big picture. And what that's really, the access that I've had to some of the data it's been pretty amazing. I actually took this position immediately following my MBA. I've been there right when COVID started. And one of the things that was positioned in one of our first quarterly meetings from our CEO and the next two down in line had to do with our position internationally with regards to supply and demand, with regards to our relationships, where the impacts are really coming from. And it was funny as we went from that conversation really to more recent conversations and the eventual impact that COVID has had upon the sales environment, the construction environment, and manufacturing. And what I mean by that is early on in the stages of COVID, it was more of a supply issue. The demand was there. That's fundamentally different from where we are now, which is a demand issue. The demand has dropped off. Our supply chain has picked up. We've been flexible. We've made the changes we need to make, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. But that has changed. So when you start to look at Economics 101 and you start to really understand who has the power structure as far as pricing, as far as materiality, and as far as deliverables, we start to look at where those relationships fall in the different environments. So to dig deep a little bit on that, when it's a supply issue, they couldn't keep up. They were having issues before we did. When I mean they, most of our manufacturing, I should have indicated that, I would say right now 90% of the manufacturing that we're doing outside of the US, we do a little bit locally and we do source locally. We really found that their impact of their factories shutting down and their factories going on hold for a little bit, beyond, it was really coming right out of the Chinese New Year, which we planned for that gap. Outside of that, this really was unexpected. There was no risk plan that really assessed okay, this is going to happen. Are we prepared for this? We were not. Like most of the manufacturing that takes place in the US with partners in China, that really was not on the radar in any great way, shape, or form. If there are a few that had planned for that, then they were doing a great job. So we had to pivot a little bit. So what it meant for us was redirecting our customer base to look at, substitutions and end user things that we could provide internally to still retain the sales. We were able to do that due to our breadth of product offering. But what it really had shown a light on was the fact that, okay, what are our other options? Are we able to manufacture elsewhere? What about our tooling? What about all the modeling, the engineering, the certification? How do we transfer that? We're now currently in the process of doing that and really broadening our supply chain so that we can look to other countries. We're looking back at the United States, we're looking at Mexico, we're looking at Vietnam, among others, and trying to figure out the long term. The short Band-Aid, right now, as far as supply chain with China is fine. They have ramped up, they are back to normal levels. We are the ones with the demand issue. Our goal to look outside of that is so that we do not get caught up in this type of scenario again, but two, we are still dealing with tariff mitigation. That's really our biggest impact right now. So some of the things that as we're coming out of this, that's being levied upon us, whether it's tariffs, whether it's, they want to share the cost of the headaches that they've had with us, and they're applying that to our cost of goods and landed cost as they come in, that affects our margins. So not only is our volume affected, but now we have to absolutely look at our margins to say, okay, can we survive that to the level that we are? The demand side of it right now is critical. We have to look at how we can grow market share with a much smaller market. One of the fascinating things that I'd like to talk about for a couple minutes, though, to explain really where some of this, and I'm really going to focus on, the built environment in the United States and the impact of that international flavor. One of the things with that is, when I talk about construction, I'm really referring to commercial construction, everything from universities to high rises to tenant build outs. A tenant build out is, let's say, LinkedIn or Google decide to move into Chicago, which they've done, and Uber. And there's a entirely different discussion around that in real estate and the impact it has on that COVID has had upon that. But with regards to construction, that's really suffered. It's down, probably in some windows about 40%. We have some thresholds that we have to maintain above, and we have been due to creativity, due to some of those efforts with our supply chain and our management of that to keep costs down and some of our creative sales. But really where the irony is, some other business units within our company have been thriving. And that has to do with home improvement, DIY. We're seeing that, a real impact from COVID, where we're all staying home, people are building pools, they're doing additions, they're doing things. Now that affects us a little bit. It affects some of our other channels a great amount. So we've actually been relying upon them to really carry the burden right now. And often those kind of counterweight each other. One business unit will support the other while we'll work on development and process for that. That's actually allowed us some of the time and the benefit to take a look at the economic impacts, to plan for them, and then to start developing product solutions and things along those lines that will help, with that regard. One of these being, and this is really how we can use product development to counteract our supply chain issues. So one of the things that I'll dig into is that we have certain back orders on products. Some of our product that comes in is just basically landed goods. They're boxed in maybe some minor assembly in the US, and then they're sold, leaving the warehouse and out the door. So one of the things I noticed, again, I've been there about 6 months, and I started to do some analysis on lost sales due to some of those back orders that were out of our hands. So some of it had to do with the product development and componentry. So we had the item that comes in, and we have about a dozen flavors of that product. Well, I started to notice some repetition on 2 or 3 of those SKUs and said, wait a minute, we're backordered on this every time, but we have the other flavors. So how do we mitigate that? Well, there are some switchable components. Literally $1 to $1.50 plastic optic lens, okay? Minor expense. So what I proposed was, okay, don't worry about bringing in the entire fixture. That might be a $50 landing cost or a $100 landing cost. Let's look at that component. Can I bring in a few thousand of those and start modifying what we have in the States? So now I'm accomplishing less inventory cost, managing our supply chain overseas much better. We had to do some certification things to allow this to go to market, which took a few weeks. But at the end of the day, what we were able to do is to plan and react in a quick way to compensate for something that's out of our hands by a very minor product development. So when you, as business students, start to really, get out in the workforce a little bit and start to engage things, that creativity and really trying to find solutions might be right under your nose. You need to really kind of understand, is there a quick fix? Hey, is there a Band-Aid that might be a long-term benefit? Which this one is. This really kind of started to change with our product development group. Okay, modularity. Can we source things so that one component can be used across multiple SKUs? That is, it's a hedge. And you need to start to look at that as, how do you hedge your risk if you're going to be in business internationally? Because if you are, you're always susceptible to trade issues, whether it's strikes, pandemic, tariffs, and you need to start to figure out how you can weather that storm and do so that you're not going to cost your bottom line. In this case, it benefited our bottom line because now we actually reduced the number of SKUs we had. We had much more flexibility. We're not as beholden to that supply chain because we could bring in an inordinate amount of those $1 components and spread it across all the parts. So you start to think about some of that creativity and how you want to handle that. The other big thing here that you need to keep in mind is, again, I'll be honest, and Professor Cinar, we've been through some economic cycles. When things are great, you never think they're going to not be great. And, don't buy into that. You always have to understand that what does come up must come down. At some point, things will start to balance. Okay, there's a very natural cycle to economics. We could write, and I'm sure there are papers. I'm not nearly as well read as your professor here, but there's the practical side of it is this, and that's what I can offer. Is the practical side of this is, in 2008, I ended up closing the business due to the economic impact that happened then. I have seen right now, pre-COVID, a boom that we were seeing, for those of you that are in Chicago, an incredible building boom that was also seen the world over. Had the benefit of traveling to China with Professor Cinar, and the vast amount of construction and economic growth, the birth of a so-called middle class in China, and the impact that had on everything we were doing here. That was supply shortage there because they were using so much of our product there, or their own supply chain means that we were second in line. That's another conversation in of itself that was actually happening pre-COVID. That was the tariffs that happened a year and a half ago or so. They were partially to balance for some of those things. But as we got to this point now, right before COVID, things were looking, a little low, but looking pretty up. The amount of economic impact that was happening and where things were going, stabilizing at a pretty solid pace was good. Well, it was not bad. And then this hit. We've seen a onslaught, and this is another point to make here, is what we've seen with some of our competition in general, and I'm not going to get into any great details, but for smaller companies that are manufacturers, we had the buffer of being owned by a larger company, having some expertise on staff to be able to mitigate this. Some of those companies have not. We've seen some bankruptcies. We've seen some manufacturers not have the ability to pay their rep agencies, their sales on down the line, and even their own supply chain. So what comes from that then is you'll start to see an onslaught of acquisitions and mergers, and you'll start to see companies start to buy one another. They'll see some, weak company that maybe has some great products, some great patents, we'll go get it. Another company will go get it. There's a lot to be ripe here for purchases. And some of those companies that are doing well, that might be privately owned and have owners that want to get out, this is also a great time for them to sell. So there's a lot of this domino effect where something so simple as, and I say simple in a very, very kind of ironic way, as this pandemic hitting has created a snowball effect, so to speak, on everything from supply chain, product development, acquisitions, the real estate market. All of those things have a direct response to what has happened. Professor, do I have a couple minutes to kind of delve into another business index? Okay, so being an architect, one of the things that I look at is called the Architectural Billings Index. It's called the ABI. This is issued through a doctorate of economics that is hired. He's the chief economist for the American Institute of Architects. Many years ago, they started putting together what's called the ABI, the Architectural Billings Index. It's one tool, but it's a great tool. And what this tool does is it identifies the billings and prospective design consulting that's going on in the market. So we're talking about some firms that are worldwide. Gensler is one of them. They have designed, the majority of the high rises in China, most of the high rises here. They're the world's largest architecture firm. They're engaging firms of that size down to any AIA member that might be 1 or 2 people. And they're analyzing their billing rate. And what that indicates is, and where I'm getting to COVID is, it starts to indicate an index. Anything above the index represents growth. Anything below the index represents a recession in billings. And then subsequently, there's about a 9 to 12 month gap from that index to shovel-ready projects actually happening, which impact my world and manufacturing and everything that follows. Well, we are currently at a level that has never been seen before, meaning it's low. So it's been below 50 before. The recession back in 2008, and after that, if any of you are old enough to remember that, that was at about probably dipping down in the high 30s. We've been in the 20s. We've elevated back up, and I like to tell people that until we hit 50, all that means is that we're less bad. Okay, it's not good to see that increase, but we're just less bad because it's an index, and if it's above that midline, that shows growth. But anything below that, and what that really translates to is that the amount of architectural billings going out, which is a predictor of the amount of construction, which means labor, material, supply chain that's going to hit the market, and is going to greatly impact everything that we need to do manufacturing, which, as I said at the beginning of this, is all coming mostly from China and other places. There's that correlation. And again, the one thing I said is at the beginning, it was a supply issue. Right now, it's a demand issue. So we intently watch where this demand is going to be. You'll see some knee-jerk reactions to the stock market. I'd like to reiterate, again, from my perspective, the stock market strength does not indicate economic strength necessarily. Keep that in mind when you see that, and that emotional wave of, oh, hey, we're at a record number. Understand there's so many other indices. There's also so many other metrics that come into play that really envelop all of the economic impact and inputs into how businesses make decisions and operate. So, Professor Cinar, with that, I would like to open this up to any questions.
Thank you. This has been very informative for me too. I did not know about this billings index. I've learned something, and I'm going to try.
I will send you a link to it. It's pretty
as a leading indicator. Yep. I have questions that were submitted. You have actually answered most of them, but let me run through them.
Sure.
Do you see the demand going back to what it was before COVID-19?
At some point, yes. I think these come in waves, and again, they're on cycles. And yes, I think that there will be. We also have an election cycle, which we didn't even talk about. But I think the election cycle always has an impact of indecision, and that's really what it is, regardless of where your party affiliation might be. That indecision tied to COVID right now it's a real thing. That impact is real. Once there's a vaccine and once there's some solid ground of understanding that confidence, once that confidence is in place, we will get a better understanding of what that return looks like. Is it going to be a V? Is it going to be a soft growth? lot of differing opinions on that. But yes, it will return. And I'm confident that actually it's going to return with a little bit of gusto.
Thank you. Question number 2. Which one changed your industry more, tariffs or COVID?
That is a great question. That's a phenomenal question. So I think tariffs on the long term, it's kind of funny. 2 years ago, I would have said tariffs because I didn't know what COVID was. But even now, as I look at it, COVID kind of shone a light on the fact that we should have probably had a better response to tariffs. I don't think businesses and international business responded enough to the impact of tariffs and made decisions long-term for risk mitigation to move manufacturing and understanding their manufacturing partners and affiliations and supply chain. I don't think enough was done, not from the government perspective, but from the business, the corporate perspective. So I would actually answer that by saying, with narrow, with short-sighted glasses on right now in the rear view, that COVID, because it is kind of, identified the fact that we should have done more, and this may not have been an issue with COVID if we had done more with the tariffs that were implemented years ago.
Good point. You actually answered some of the questions. One was, is China your biggest source? And you talked about how you were looking at other sources.
Yes.
You also answered bankruptcies and furloughs in your industry, and you said this is leading to mergers and acquisitions and bankruptcies.
Yes.
Another question is, how do you see the urban construction in New York City and Chicago, given what's happening these days?
Sure. So that's if I have a couple minutes on that. So I actually have a daughter that lived in New York City. I've been in New York City twice since COVID has hit. Once was to move her home initially, and then we had to go back and move her out of her apartment lease. So I was in New York City at the end of July. If you've ever been there, you would know how amazing it is to be able to walk down any street, especially the main streets, literally walk down the middle of the street and not have any traffic. It was surreal. I could get a seat. It was right when the restaurants opened. I could get a seat at any restaurant I wanted. That we took advantage of. To answer the question, so ironically, the markets right now that we're doing very well in, that are still holding that commercial end of it, are still the East Coast, meaning New York and the other metropolises on the East Coast that are rather large, from Philadelphia to DC to Boston. Chicago's actually held its own pretty well. Outside of my company, the companies that I know that are still engaged, has it recessed? Yes, but they didn't shut down construction. That was considered an essential business. I have friends and colleagues at Walsh Construction, at Turner, et cetera, some of the largest contractors in the country and in the world, honestly, and hospital work. There's been, some industries that, everything from grocery stores. We're involved in many of those right now. Grocery stores, healthcare. Some of those industries are actually doing better than pre-COVID. Majority of the corporate world, not so much. We're starting to see the tech companies, start to shift a little bit in the positive. So again, there's been definite impacts, but like I said, I think this is going to rebound. I think it's a nice pause. The multifamily, the tenant build out, some of those things, yeah, definitely a hit. But it's a dynamic industry, and it's a diverse one as well.
There's another question which asks, did the transportation costs between China and the U.S. changed with the tariff discussions and with COVID? Did they go up? Are the number of ships less?
Yeah, they did go up. Less ships, costs go up, the tariffs increased. So that's a great question as well. That all impacts it. So that's one of those discussions I have. So one of my roles is to make sure that we get stuff done. And if I have to air freight, I always say overnight, but if I have to air freight something in to finish off a project, keep a client happy, et cetera, that impact is really, we actually saw that quadruple in the matter of a few weeks, right when tensions and we saw the levels where COVID started to become, it's kind of an issue. It's a big issue. Like, okay, this is it, guys. So we started to see those costs escalate. So normal decisions that I could make easily had to get other levels of approval. I really had to make a business case for it. all those things came into it. So yeah, that absolutely happened.
There's one last question from apparently a junior being a senior this year, undergraduate. This is the last question. What is your best advice for an undergraduate IB major graduating next summer?
So I have a son that's in that same position. So
Very
I
tough.
think, yep, hang tough. Don't be discouraged. Understand that you might have to pivot a little bit. Okay, all of our dreams pivot from time to time. That's life. The best thing I could tell you is to be flexible, to take an opportunity that you may not think is the ideal opportunity for you. At the end of the day, years from now, you're going to look back and say, I survived. I got through this. In fact, I prospered because I wasn't so set in my ways. I was able to be flexible. I went into a little bit different path. You don't know where that path could go. It could be your fortune. You don't know. Or it could be one of the biggest hardships that you're going to go through in your life, which could also be part of your foundation. When you move on, you can lean back on that. You know, I've closed a company through a recession. I've been in your position back in the early 90s when there were no jobs to be had in Chicago in architecture. I ended up having to work in Indiana. I met my wife. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary. See what happens? If I had gotten that job in Chicago proper, may have never happened. Have to look for that silver lining because you don't know. Take advantage of, let's say, the disruption. Take advantage of that to say, you know what? My path was this. Screw it. I'm going to do what's in front of me. I'm going to live life to the fullest, figure it out. Boy, this is awful. This is not what I anticipated. You know what? It's years from now, it's going to help you be tougher. It's going to be that practice and that chink in your armor where you can say, you know what? I've lived through some struggles. It's made me better at business. It makes you a better decision manager. It makes you better to understand your risks. So that's my advice.
What a beautiful closure. This
Yeah.
is fantastic. This is so good. Thank you so much. We're really proud of you, and I'm honored that you had the time to talk to us today. I'm going to, let's see, share the screen and see if I can put up the final slide.
Sure.
But thank you very much, and we truly appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you, and glad I could help, and it was really a pleasure to speak to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.